served.
Well, I mean the one that that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton seems to be talking about there in competition with the channels she's mentioned, including AlJazeera.
She's right. I mean, if you compare the impact of AlJazeera or the impact of Al-Hurra, the American government-sponsored Arabic news channel, which very few people watch in the Middle East, although, incidentally, after the beginning of these uprisings in the Middle East, it has suddenly increased its viewership. But AlJazeera is far and away the most important, the one that has had the greatest influence, and the one that has really changed, I think, the degree of political sophistication of the Arab population of the Middle East. It has been partly responsible for what is happening now, simply because it is presenting not government television, not propaganda. It tries to show both sides or three sides of a question, and as a result has made the population of Tunisia, of Egypt, and the other countries in the Middle East more aware of what's going on in the rest of the Arab world, and less likely to believe the propaganda they get from their government television.
All right, Professor Abdullah Schleifer.
We don't have anything to come.
We could shift gears a little bit. Professor Abdullah Schleifer, you've worked, so to speak, on both sides of the divide for American networks, for Arab networks. Why is the U.S. narrative losing the war here?
Well, first of all, Sammy, let me start by saying I never thought of myself, whether I was working for NBC or AlJazeera or as a regular contributor to Jazeera English, I never thought of myself as a foot soldier in anybody's information war. I'm a journalist. And as a journalist, I would say that the quality of American network of television journalism has deteriorated, especially if we're talking about international coverage, foreign coverage. It's deteriorated terribly over the past couple decades. And there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that it became a profit center. You know, when network news started, it was originally considered a public service. It wasn't a profit center. That was for entertainment. But it became a profit center, which made it very nice for us back in the 70s because we could hire Lear jets all the time. But the problem is that the viewership of American network television has declined radically over the last couple of decades because of competition from cable, from many other sources, of course, the internet. Now, when your profits decline, you have the only way you can maintain a profit is either to maintain your audience, which they didn't, the audiences have declined, or you cut your costs. So the first decision was to cut foreign coverage. So whereas
hang on, Professor Abdullah, is the assumption, is what you're saying here, that somehow they reached the conclusion that you cannot make any money in the US by covering international news? Well,
what it is that international news is costly, and there's greater interest in, unless there's some extraordinary some extraordinary incident going on, a sort of full column headline in a newspaper, that type of incident, like the uprising in Egypt or like the tsunami, that generally people are more interested in national news and even local news. So therefore, if the networks have to cut their costs, which is the only way they can sustain their profits, by cutting their cost, they're going to cut their costs by closing down their foreign bureaus. And that's what happened.
Okay.
Back in the 70s, all the networks maintained bureaus here in Cairo, especially from the mid-70s on. And those bureaus are gone.
Right.
CNN is the only one that maintains a full bureau.
OK, let's bring in, if we could, Charlie Wolf into this discussion. I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton mentioned things like too many commercials, too many talking heads, opinion, and we've got what Professor Abdullah Schleifer said, not enough bureaus. Is it the responsibility, or should we blame the media for any loss in American narrative in the world or international war over media?
No, actually, I don't think we should. And this is where I was a bit struck by her comments. They seemed a bit disconnected and confused. I can't disagree really to a great extent with my two colleagues. American news is not as foreign-based as it used to be. American news reporting has probably declined in many respects from, those of us from the old school would probably say. But she was sitting in front of this Senate hearing, Foreign Relations Committee hearing, about budgets for the government. It's the government's job to make their case in the great war of ideas. It's not up to NBC, CBS, or ABC to do that. They're commercial enterprises to serve their audiences in a free and open market. And again, we can debate whether they're doing it correctly or incorrectly, and it's their shareholders who'll either win or lose as to how this is doing. But to sit there and talk about Al Jazeera or the BBC on the world stage and then complain because CBS has commercials or NBC, or funny enough, she was talking about the irony of, she was going on about them having nothing but talking heads, and here we are, 3 talking heads on Al Jazeera, so a bit of irony there. So
is there
I'm not quite sure what she was
perhaps
getting
with
at.
the commercial model, or the way that the commercial model has evolved in the US, Charlie?
Not fully. How they're running their business models, and yes, they're now cutting costs to some extent, and it may not have the same public service notion that it may have had back in, say, the 70s or 80s. But that said, we have a free and open press. They are commercial concerns, and people have the right to run their businesses as they see fit. And obviously, their audiences must be attracted to this, or if the audiences really wanted more international news, they'd be doing it. I think to some extent there's a slight cultural difference between those of us living in London, where, obviously I watch the BBC and get a lot of foreign news, and I watch Al Jazeera from time to time and Press TV, and the United States, where they're more domesticated models, and people want to know, as I remember from my early radio days, everything is local.
All right, if we could go back to Tom once again, but is the drive for opinion also to blame for what's happened within the US network system?
Well, it's part of the problem. To have an opinion, you need facts, and of course the problem with American coverage nowadays, and particularly of foreign affairs, there is so little. It is so thin. There's so few facts. So a small amount of factual information is being chewed over again and again by the opinionators of the right and the left. And to go back to what Charlie Wolf said, he's right that Secretary Clinton had somewhat confused the issues, but she was comparing American domestic networks and the coverage that they give the American public, and what is known as public diplomacy, the government's own efforts through the Voice of America, AlJazeera, or whatever, to present an American point of view to the rest of the world. The basic problem that is facing American broadcast television is that it used to be considered a lost leader. It was your ticket to get a piece of the electromagnetic spectrum of the airwaves, your frequency. In return, you had to perform a public service. And American networks performed a pretty darn good public service. They had CBS, for example, the network that I worked for many years, had so many foreign correspondents. At one point, they had a full-time foreign correspondent in West Beirut and another full-time foreign correspondent in East Beirut. That was two.
Gosh, those were the days, I guess, Tom Fenton. But we're hearing a lot from our guests about confusing the issue here. What is the issue that the US